Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, May 25th, 2020, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And for those of us living in the United States, of course, today we observe Memorial Day, previously known as Decoration Day. This is a federal holiday here in the U.S. where we honor the lives lost from individuals serving in the United States Armed Forces. And if you are a loved one of a fallen service person, I want to let you know that I'm so grateful for their service, and I am deeply, deeply sorry for your loss. This is a day of mourning and remembrance. This is, well, it is in the U.S. now also a day of retail sales, but I contend that it should not be. And I think that we should all remember how important this day actually is. All right. I'm really excited about this week's episode. Before we dive into it, though, I do want to thank some special individuals who have helped make Talk Nerdy, that's my show, possible this week. Remember, my show is and will always be 100% free to download, and that's because of the support from listeners just like you. So I'm not going to do any sort of pitch because that would not be in the spirit of exactly what I was just talking about. But I do want to thank those of you who have supported the show over the past week. So let's pull that up. All right. I want to thank the top supporters, including Michael Gaucher, Christopher Pitts, Mary Neva, Pasquale Gelati, Ulrika Hagman, Dudas Infinitus, Brian Holden, Daniel Lang, and last but not least, David J.E. Smith. Thank you so much. It is because of you that individuals who wouldn't otherwise be able to support the show can continue to listen to it free of charge. All right, so let's talk about this week's episode. This is a really fun one for me. I'm so bummed that I couldn't do it in person, of course, because of lockdown. But I am very excited that I had a chance to have on the show an old friend, Conor Knighton. Now, he's a correspondent for CBS Sunday Morning and has won Emmys doing his amazing work on that show. It's here in the U.S. It's a news program on one of our basic television networks. He's the creator and producer of the On the Trail series of CBS Sunday Morning. And it's all about national parks. And he's also the creator of Island Hopping, an ongoing series where he visits islands all over the world. He's an incredibly talented individual. I got to know him when we were both reporters working for SoCal Connected on KCET. But he has gone on to do great things. And one of the great things that he has done recently is write a new book, his first book, actually. It's called Leave Only Footprints, My Acadia-to-Zion Journey Through Every National Park. Oh, I love it. All right, get ready to be inspired. Without any further ado, here he is, Conor Knighton. Well, Conor, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, thank you. Good to talk to you.
It's been, how long have we, since we've spoken in person when we used to work together all the time?
Yeah, right. And I vaguely remember some Los Feliz hang at a coffee shop that might not even exist anymore that was beneath the Chase Bank over there. Is that still a place?
It's still a place. And I remember, now that you've triggered this memory, I was late because I was trying to find a physical newspaper.
Oh, I vividly remember that. Yeah. It's such a weird reason to be late anytime post 1995. I very much remember that. And I do forget if you actually found one or not. Did you succeed?
I don't think I did at the time because I went to like 2 grocery stores and
Albertsons, which is down there.
Yeah, and a gas station. I'm like, don't they sell like the New York Times at the gas station? But no. And I think after that, I started subscribing regularly. Eventually, I moved over to only digital because I did find that when I got the physical paper, it was amazing to me that anybody could read a physical paper cover to cover every. That would have to be your full-time job.
Yeah, and there's people who take pride in it, but I almost feel like it's a foolish pride. It's like because it's there are some missable things in that cover to cover paper. You are wasting your time if you are reading that instead of some article from a different paper, or that would be a different website.
True, exactly. There was something kind of beautiful to me at the time, and I think this was like during, well, of course it's still the case, but during like cover to cover Trump coverage and what new stupid thing did he do or say? And so I was like, okay, there's something about like a curated, getting a little nibble from everything instead of just reading the same story reported by 10 different outlets. But it's so much content and it takes so long to read. And I found myself taking like the entire art section and the entire sports section and just putting them in the recycle bin. And I was like, ooh, I feel guilty about this.
No, for sure.
Live and learn. So yes, journalism. We met when we worked together at KCET on SoCal Connected years ago now, because we both left, I think, around the same time. Did you continue after I left?
No, I think it was like late 2015, I guess, was the last thing I did for them.
Gotcha. So. Yeah, we did multiple seasons and we would do it was mostly like feature type stories. And you had been working for CBS Sunday Morning. Had you been doing that through your tenure at KCET, which is now actually part of the PBS family, or back to being part of the PBS family?
Oh,
were you at
gosh,
CBS
I haven't paid attention to that. Yeah, no, I would.
So, you didn't know that.
I didn't know it switched back because it was this way confusing thing to explain to people that, like, yes, it's public television, but no, it's not PBS, which just sort of blew people's minds. So I didn't actually know they joined back.
It's now back in the family, which I kind of knew because I was following, but also I know because I was lucky enough to go back to the studio along with our colleague.
Right now,
yeah, with Nick Cha Kim to do some intros for a lot of PBS programming that's like educational programming for the high school kids in LA.
That they're doing that. I guess I didn't know that. I didn't. Even when I saw that, I didn't make the distinction that now they had joined forces. I thought it was just like a brief cooperation. I didn't know that they were all under the same roof.
Part of the family, but I think they still maintain their like network, like the actual broadcast station is still KCET, and then there's still PBS SoCal, but they're all PBS. Like when you go to the PBS app on your Apple TV or wherever you get it, which is how I consume all my television recently. All I watch now is like Frontline and American Experience and all these amazing PBS documentary series. And of course, CBS Sunday Morning. The way that you do it is you go to the app and then everything's there. You can even find SoCal Connected, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. Anyway. Well, so to answer your question, I was at CBS even during that time and for a couple of years before, but as a contributor. So since Sunday Morning is one of those shows that's been on for 40 years, there is a long list of people who have would like to be on it, even within the CBS family. There's people who work for some of the other shows who'll be featured. And so I felt very lucky to get my 3 or 4 or maybe tops 6 segments a year while I had some other jobs. So it was never my full-time thing until 2016. And I'm sure we'll talk about that year here in a second. But like that's when it became full-time, and it's been full-time ever since. But when you and I were hanging out at KCET, honestly, that was paying the bills more than CBS was. And as you know, that wasn't paying the bills a ton either.
No. Public TV is not really a moneymaker, right. But we were lucky enough that we got a lot of work, at least many, many days out of the year, many stories that we got to cover. And so it seems like pretty convenient then. Do you think it was a convenient coincidence, or was it something you really pushed for, where kind of you left KCET and then pretty soon after that were able to make CBS Sunday Morning or CBS your full-time gig?
Well, so, I mean, it really only came about because of this year of the national parks. And so that was a pitch that I sent to them. It was not an assignment. And that kind of by design had to be a full-time thing. So that was sort of the drop-off point. Had that not occurred, I'm sure I would have continued with KCET for a little while past that. But it was Sunday Morning's the kind of show that would probably do a piece about the national parks. And so when I saw that it was the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service, and this was towards the end of 2015, I saw that the next year would be the centennial. And I thought, well, okay, like maybe I should pitch that to them. That's a story they might let me do. And then deleted that email and outlined a very ambitious, very outlandish year's worth of stories for a show I did not really work for. Like I was a pinch hitter, but I was like, you know what? What if we did like a year's worth of stories on the national parks, and there's got to be a bunch of cool things, and like there'll be the same types of stories you would have seen on Sunday Morning any year about food or family or art or architecture. I'll just set them all within the parks. And remarkably, they said yes to that. We did about a third of the parks for the show. And then once that looked like it might happen, I decided, well, you know what? I'm just going to go all in on this. I gave up my place in LA. I put my stuff in storage, and I decided to live on the road that whole year and go to all the rest of the parks that we weren't going to ever even talk about on the broadcast, just for me. A, because I thought it would be fun, and B, because I thought, like, like guy that goes to the third of the parks, you don't want to talk to that guy. Guy that goes to all the parks, that's a cool guy. So,
oh my
just
gosh,
for like
why
my
didn't I realize that? I thought that the assignment for you and the series really was like, let's go to every national park in a year.
well, and to our mutual benefit, if we may present it like that sometimes on air, like, hey, Connor's headed to all the national parks, but like
Yeah.
it was just too wonky to get into like the finances of how that was working out, like as we described that. But the truth was, like, I took it was a better premise for the show for me, but I took the money that I had been spending to live in LA full time and use that to make up the difference. And so when we would finish filming a segment in Alaska, where there are 8 national parks, and we did about 3 or 4 of them for the show, at the end of that, my cameraman flew home to Arizona where he lived, and I stayed out on the road. And then from that moment on, I'm on my own dime, I'm on my own time. And then I would pick up again whenever I had the next story. So it was, often like, it was this weird puzzle of weather and geography because I was producing all those pieces. And so I was trying to figure out like, okay, where do I need to be when, and then how can I hit these other places along the way that I personally want to go to? The book is about all of them. So, from a reader standpoint, they're all treated equally. But during the year that I was visiting them, some were like fully fleshed out research stories that I was doing for television. Some were just places where I wanted to go on a fun hike. But inevitably, I would find a really interesting story there as well that I wish we would have done for the show. And so that's when the book started to crystallize, where I was like, well, you know what? These are all fascinating spots. What if I kind of looked at them as this one larger unit and kind of wrote about them in total?
Oh gosh, so many questions come to mind. Like the first one is, did you find that when your camera guy flew home and you were out there by yourself, that there would be like all these times you're like, damn it, I wish that my camera guy was here to capture this?
Yes, and or to capture it, or to just share it with. I mean, it became a kind
Right.
of relationship. He was someone I'd worked with a long time ago on the show back in Phoenix, and didn't really even know him that well. Honestly, he just struck me as like a good guy. And then when it came time for this year, the way a CBS shoot normally works is the correspondent flies in, the camera person flies in, audio person flies in, producer flies in, maybe from 4 different places. We all go to the world's largest mailbox in Indiana or whatever, and then we all go our separate ways. With this, I convinced them that like it would really be helpful if I could just have someone who was my guy for the year. I was already producing all the stories, so that saved them a body. And I was like, if we can get someone who can do camera and audio together and just sort of keep him with me for that journey, then since so much of this was outside, like if the sunset is rained out that one night in Big Bend in Texas, I want to be able to stay another night. Whereas the way a typical shoot would work, that camera person would be assigned to like cover the Super Bowl the next day or something. So he and I linked up together for most of the year. So he wasn't working on separate pieces when he wasn't with me. But that's a lot of time in a Subaru together. I mean, we got to know each other really, really well. Although the first moment when I realized that like how little I knew this person I was about to spend a year with was on the first shoot we did together was at Biscayne National Park in Florida, a park that is 95% water, 5% land. We're about to get out on this boat. I'd arranged to go scuba diving with this ranger. They had these amazing shipwrecks. There's this underwater trail. And I'd hired a specific underwater photographer for that day because that's a very specialized skill. But Ephraim, the cameraman, was going to shoot everything from the boat. And as we're getting onto the boat, he's like, oh, it's my first time on a boat. And I'm like, what? Like your first time on this kind of boat, right? And he's like, no, dude, any boat. And like, I went down the list of boats. I was like, a pontoon boat. Like you went to Boy Scout camp, right? Like a kayak, literally no boats. And then finally he's like, well, when my mom brought me from Mexico when I was 5, she put me on this piece of plywood and floated me across the Rio Grande. Is that a boat? And I'm like, no, that's not a boat. And also, who are you? Like, and that began this really interesting friendship, which is sort of strung throughout the book. I mean, he's a supporting character in that narrative, but it was always fun to have him to bounce things off of because as we got to know each other and I got to know his story, he was invested in my story. I would sometimes, go on dates on the road, and he was always the first. I mean, he had his favorites. He always wanted to know who people were. So it became, but I mean, really, the bromance was me and him, and we were often in these like very picturesque honeymoon kind of locations. Two straight guys don't go to the Virgin Islands together, but we did because we shot a story on Virgin Islands National Park. So that's a very long answer to your question. I apologize, but yeah, we were very frequently, when we were joined, it was such a tight bond, and he now has a full-time gig with CBS, and so I share him with other producers and correspondents now, but we still.
Oh, how sad.
Yeah, I know.
Wait, what's his name? We've been talking about him as he this whole time.
Efrain Robles, good dude.
Efrain, got it.
Yeah, welcome to my year of everyone, welcome to his life of trying to get people to say that correctly. You actually got it pretty right off the bat, but I think it's an uncommon name, Efrain, and we're often in like Alamosa, Colorado, where someone's like, Ephraim? And it's like, no, Ephraim. So he kind of just goes by E a lot to make it simpler for folks. But
gotcha.
Talented guy, nice guy. So.
Oh my gosh, I love that. And so, the book that you wrote, and I should say the title again, Leave Only Footprints, My Acadia-to-Zion Journey Through Every National Park. This is, part travelogue, part memoir, part really in many ways, I guess, personal philosophy. And it's that story, like you said, of being on assignment, but then the in-between times, making sure to hit up every single national park is it not just the contiguous United States, but all 50 states and the territories, right?
And the territories, yeah. I mean, American Samoa was the furthest I went. And there's one there. There's two in Hawaii. There's one in the Virgin Islands. So yeah, it's barely possible to do them in a year, but it was possible. But you don't have much time to spare.
Right. And you have to kind of, like you said, give up a lot. Like you can't really be tethered to home. And you, in many ways, just kind of cut all of those tethers that you had for the time being so that you could 100% dedicate yourself to being on the road. Did you come home at all during that year? And by home, I mean, I don't know, to LA? Is that home?
Yeah, I mean, it was for a decade. But I did not. I gave up my place. I didn't have a home. I didn't have a home to go back to. West Virginia, where I'm home, that's home originally. I went there a couple of times as I would pass through, but no, I was pretty much, taking advantage of lingering in some places that I may never be back to again. And so I would stay in Springdale, Utah, or some of these small towns near the parks. And so that was my home for the year. I actually think mentally it would have been a weirder whiplash to come back, have some sugarfish sushi, see my friends, and then pop back out again. So yeah, mostly I stayed out on the road full time.
So did you, I'd say what percentage, and I don't even know if you can quite calculate this quickly, but what percentage would you say that you camped, slept in hotels, slept in your car? Like, how did you actually make this work?
So I started to feel like a bit of a fraud because the hotel percentage was high. And that's partially because of the work element of this. Like we're traveling with expensive camera gear when we were doing stories for work. We need Wi-Fi. We need FedEx, just the nuts and bolts of how a show gets made. Because we would constantly send these pieces back to New York where they would cut them and put them on air. So for those parks I was in, they weren't nice hotels. By the way, I dare you to find a nice hotel near Great Sand Dunes National Park. Like it's a Hampton Inn at best, like a Holiday Inn Express, maybe. So I was doing some of that, but then camping, when I was on my own, then it was more maybe 40% camping when it was me on my own time and dime because it's cheaper and it's more fun. And there's some of the parks where it's kind of the only way to experience them. I don't know if there was a night where I slept in a car. We got close a couple of times, but yeah, I think I always found a way to pitch a tent or find a cheap hotel on the side of the road or something like that.
Right. And when you slept, so I just recently camped on my friend's property in Joshua Tree because I had to get out of my house for a couple of days during this crazy pandemic lockdown. And she has, all this acreage there. So basically just drove, pitched a tent, slept and came back home. Actually looked at the stars, set up my telescope and stuff. But I do find that when I sleep outside, I'm a little bit of a wimp. Like I love camping and I love all the rustic aspects of it, except for how hard the ground is. And so I have like the most ridiculously luxe REI, like 4-inch sleeping pad with memory foam. And I can imagine if I'm sleeping on the ground a lot, like you said, 40% of the time that you were in the cities that you weren't filming in or in the parks that you weren't filming in. What's your camping accoutrement? How do you do it to stay comfy?
I'm embarrassed that it's not that nice. like I didn't have too much time to adjust. Now the next stuff I buy will be top of the line everything, but I didn't really have that then. So I mean, it's fine. I mean, you definitely need some sort of a sleeping pad. I don't know why that took me a long time to realize. I was like, okay, well, you have the sleeping bag and you have the tent, but there was a third thing you need, whether it's 4 inches or not. You need something to separate you, just even for warmth, like that helps with heat retention. So yeah, it wasn't a great setup. My sister is better at this than I am, honestly. She actually was once a park ranger at Yosemite, and she has a big Agnes sleeping bag, and they have
Nice.
an insertable, like, how would you describe it? It's like a sleep system where like the pad is attached to the bag so you don't roll off it. And I think that will be my next one. So in a way, I'll give you my future setup versus my current setup, because my current setup's not very good. But I'm like you. I like the sleeping on the ground part isn't great. Like there's some people who get off on that. Like I will camp if it lets me have access to parts of the park that I wouldn't have otherwise. And so there are some parks like Isle Royal in Michigan. That's a park you have to access via a boat or a seaplane. You will hike for, 7-8 miles. You'll camp, you'll hike 7-8 miles the next day. Camping really is the only way to truly see that park. But to see Zion National Park, you can camp in that campground that's right by the entrance and have cars driving by you all night long, or you can stay at the Best Western a mile further down the street. And I honestly don't think that there's a cost difference between the two, but I don't think there's an experience difference. And honestly, if you're better rested at the Best Western, there's no shame in that. So I would frequently stay in those gateway towns versus, on the ground just for the sake of it. But at a park like Lake Clark National Park in Alaska, where there are very few hotels, camping's just sort of what you do. And I'm glad I did.
And honestly, that's really what sparked me to ask that question is, I think about how exhausted I am when I'm on a TV show that requires that I be on the road for a long time, and even staying in nice hotels. And honestly, like at this point in my career, having in my contract that I like fly first class if I'm going farther than 3 hours from home, and or flights that are longer than 3 hours from home, and like all these like creature comforts that I'm able to negotiate into my contracts that are really just there because it's not uncommon to be on a red-eye flight and have to wake up first thing in the morning, go to hair and makeup, and like get straight in front of the camera. And if you're sleeping in coach, and there's a baby crying and there's like an armrest in your back, like you're going to be terrible at your job. And I think about what it would be like camping all the time and then rolling out of bed and filming, and how I would just be in pain. I think as much as I love camping, my back always hurts when I sleep on the ground more than like 2 or 3 days in a row.
I mean, there's a reason we built houses. Like at some point, we just sort of realized as a society, like, okay, this sort of sucks. Like we could do better. So yeah, if it's your day to day, it's not a great way to be. So I feel you. There's no shame in wanting a hotel bed.
So how much of the book did you dedicate? And of course, I could also ask the same thing about the production of the show, the episodes, since you said that, of course, you were producing them as well. How much of the dedication was to sort of the experience and the current now of the national park system and structure in the U.S., and how much of it was the historical, like this is how it was first formed, these are the people who were involved in its journey, like kind of, a lot of what we know or what we love about the national parks is their long, kind of very Americana history.
Mm-hmm. So the one advantage of going to all of them and not just a handful or half of them is that you start to see the threads that tie them all together. So when that year was finished and I was looking back on it, that's how I decided the structure of the book was thematically. I was able to find, a link between Dry Tortugas National Park in Florida and Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona, thousands of miles apart. But to me, they both told a story of forgiveness. Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado, Great Smoky Mountains National Park in North Carolina and Tennessee. Those I linked through a story of home that I found spoke to me there. At Mesa Verde, it's these ancient cliff dwellings. At Great Smoky Mountains, it's a much more recent story that I told about these settlers who'd been asked to leave during World War II and then weren't allowed back. Also the same story that happened to the Cherokee long before that. And so that's how I grouped the book and how I've started to think about it. In terms of the history, I mean, the origins of the Park Service is a fascinating story, one that I think is probably better told in something like America's Best Idea, that Ken Burns PBS series. If we're going to be talking about awesome PBS things, if you've never watched that, that's amazing.
Seriously.
It's probably 6 hours in before you even get to Grand Canyon being established as a park. There's a story of folks from John Muir to Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, who were all involved in the creation of the Park Service. I don't touch so much on that, although I do a little bit. All of those people feature into the book, but I'm going for much more specific histories that I didn't know that stood out to me. So there's a good chunk of history in the book, but just not so much of the how did these places get made in the beginning. Maybe more like what's an unexpected history of a thing I found in one.
Sure. And of course, like you mentioned, like not only has that been done, but it's been done a lot of times, and it's been done by some of the greats like Ken Burns. Yeah. And sort of the travelogue experience, I think, in so many ways is so relevant to a lot of people, not just, and I mean, we could have a whole conversation about the fact that we're all stuck inside right now, and that your book came out like just as the national parks were being all shut down.
So my timing is perfect. Every bookstore and almost all national parks are closed. So good for me.
Well, but that just means you'll get a whole second one. Because here's the crazy, amazing thing, Conor. Like, your book is a New York Times bestseller. Your book is trending on all these lists. It's like on Amazon, it's #1 in parks and campgrounds. It's #1 in Yosemite, California books. It's like, it's constantly peaking on all these different lists on Amazon. Like, this book is kicking ass, and nobody can even go to the national parks right now. Oh, and this is my favorite. I don't know if you've been following it lately. But you have, a bunch of reviews on Amazon, which make me very happy. They're all 5-star reviews, except for one 1-star review, badge of honor. And it says, are you ready for this?
I think I might have read this one. Yeah. Is his name? What's crazy is I know his name, I think, because I looked at it. It's something like, and I don't care if I say his name. His name's on Amazon. I think it's Barry Winston, right?
It is Barry Winston.
Yeah, exactly. I hate that I know that. I aspire to be a guy one day who doesn't know his 1-star review, but I do currently know that guy is named Barry Winston. And screw you, Barry Winston. You bought the wrong thing. It's not my fault.
Here's his review. Wrong order completely. I did not order a Kindle version of this book. I do not own a Kindle. I ordered 2 hardback editions of the book, period. Well, you know what?
Yeah, no, you didn't, Barry. No, you didn't. Like, I know, like, there is no way in hell you went on Amazon, click, I would like to buy 2 hardcovers, and they're like, nope, here's a Kindle book. You clearly clicked the wrong thing. I'm flattered that you wanted to buy any version of my book, so I'm not mad, but I just think this is probably on you, Barry. It is not. Barry. Don't bring down my average. Come on.
Exactly. I don't think Barry realized that the ratings and reviews are for the writing, not for Amazon service. Come on, Barry.
I was joking about that with my brother, and I think that like if I live by the olds, I've got to die by the olds. And my guess is Barry may be a little older. And like, there are some older Sunday Morning fans who are lovely and are bread and butter. And so I think many of them have gotten this book. So if once in a while there's one who's not as tech savvy who accidentally bought the Kindle version, then I have to deal with the downside as well. Oh, well.
And you know what? Then your ratings and reviews don't seem algorithmic. You got to always have one low rating, right?
And then point. It's like, better it be for the wrong format than like, oh, this guy's jokes are terrible or his writing's awful. So
how dare he travel the whole country? Yeah. And that's the other thing about kind of why I think that this book is so relevant to a lot of people's lives right now is like, yes, we're all stuck inside. And I think there's sort of a yearning to reconnect with nature that a lot of people are experiencing right now. But I also think that there's been kind of a slow movement and a national park movement that it's existed since they were founded, right? Like when I was a child, we would go on road trips to the Grand Canyon or to all these different parks in Texas to Big Bend. And we would camp and we would take the boat out and we would go, boating on lakes, whether they were national or state or even city parks. And it was a big part of my family. And I think a lot of people remember that. But as adults, I think we often do think of people who spend time in parks as sort of the CBS Sunday Morning viewer. Like we just think of them as a little bit older, a little bit slower in their pace. But lately there's been a kind of Airstream, VW van, like camp. That's like my whole Instagram is just ads for like, bracelets with peace signs and like sleeping sacks and, like all this like very like trendy, cool camp gear. Cause that's like a new thing that a lot of people are experiencing, I think, being stuck inside a lot. And also just, I don't know, I think sort of generations, and this happens probably with each generation, is just more aware. They're more aware of climate change. They're more aware of plastic pollution. They're more aware of, some real changes that we can be making. And in order to make those changes and to be sort of mindful about our conduct on the planet, you have to go outside.
Yeah. So it's this weird balance because the parks have, like, on a numbers level, never been more popular. They are more visited now than they have ever been. And that number, like, they're just smashing through records every year. And I think some of that is social media, for sure. Like, when you see that picture of that beautiful viewpoint, you want to go to that park, and probably you want to go to that viewpoint. And so sometimes that is this darker side to the recent popularity, is that there are certain, an Instagram photo doesn't come with a difficulty rating, and so if you're like, oh, I got to get that same picture, well, maybe you're not the kind of hiker who can get to that. But if you're determined to get that photo, you might be unsafe. You might take some shortcuts. There might be places that could deal with 100 visitors a year. And now if there's 10,000 going to that same trail, well, there's some, ecological sort of damage kind of issues that come with that. But the demographic is shifting. I think what the parks want to make sure of is that because they are taxpayer funded, this is a thing that, Congress approves their budget every year. That works as long as people feel connected to them and want to support them. They have very high levels of approval. Everyone loves the parks. But as the demographics of America shift, and especially as that shift becomes a non-majority white population, the parks are very white. And so, and they know that, and they're making steps to address it. But there's just more like moral reasons why that needs to be better. But even just for like survival of the parks reasons, I was talking to Sally Jewell, who was formerly the Secretary of Interior and was during the year I was doing this. And she made the point that like, why would you continue to give support for something you don't feel connected to? And if that's the story of a lot of America, if you don't feel welcomed in the parks, then why do you care if they're still around? And so they even just from like a survival instinct, they want to make sure that it is not just that white REI hiker,
Instagrammer.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a lot of that, and it's helping, and there's that's moving in the right direction. But I'd say on a visitation standpoint, that's what the parks need to address the most to continue to stay relevant and protected.
It is one of those funny kind of almost paradoxes where it's like something that is so, in many ways, cheap or free or accessible or whatever you want to call it, because it's just nature, is at the same time on the same kind of side of the coin something that you almost need to be in a privileged position to either know to access or to have the kinds of capabilities to take off of work and do a family vacation, to have the transportation to get there, to, like you said, like have gone to REI or even to Costco and like buy the tents and buy all the things. Like there are definitely ways to visit the parks, I think, very freely and cheaply. But at the same time, there is sort of like a privilege to be able to spend time in our national parks.
Yeah, absolutely. For everything you just said, there's the leisure time, there's the cost of getting there. Once you're there, the $30 that it costs to enter a park, or $45 maybe on the upper end, like that's not the deciding factor, I don't think, for many folks. But
and can't you get like a thing to go to all of them?
Yeah, which, boy, I felt bad. I got such a good deal out of that. It's $80 for the entire year.
Oh yeah,
I think it's $130 to go to Disney and like California Adventure for a day. So like, yes, I more than made that. I actually, at one point, I lost my wallet in Seattle, like midway through the trip, which meant I had to buy another. I had to do a bunch of other annoying things with my bank, but one other thing I had to do was buy another one of these park passes, and I was happy to do it. I'd already way got my money's worth. So yes, the parks are a good deal by design, but you're right. All the cost of getting to them, the Yellowstone's in Wyoming. And so and with a big old white population in Wyoming. And so for someone to travel there, like that is, there's expense to that. There's time, all kinds of stuff. And then there's just feeling welcome. They're seeing people who look like you at the entrance gate. And so heck, that could have been its own book right there, but it did not take many parks for me to recognize that, that trend. So.
Absolutely. And I mean, and I think in some ways, obviously, like even beyond this sort of barrier and this like dividing line that you probably, became more and more salient the more you traveled, maybe this is a stereotype, but I also assume that part of the reason that I think of parks as being kind of welcoming to an older population is because of the fact that older, especially white or previously and continuing to be kind of privileged people, retire. They're the ones who
Yeah.
like have the leisure time.
Sure. And by the way, that's an even better deal. That I believe they may have just raised the price on that, but at the time it was $10 senior citizen pass, which gets you into every park for the rest of your life. So you pay that
Whoa,
every month. I think now it's gone up to 80, but still for the rest of your life.
that's
So that's
amazing.
amazing. Yeah, I met this retired couple at Canyonlands National Park, which is one of my favorites in Utah near Moab, where Arches National Park is as well. And it's just one of those trailside conversations that happens in the parks. And what I love about them, I can walk down a New York City street and not say hi to anybody. If you do, they think you're
Mm.
crazy or trying to get them to sign a petition or something. But in a park, you say hi to everybody you meet on the trail. And this couple, Tony and Linda Oyster were their names. We talked for a good 45 minutes, and they'd asked me, where I lived, and I got to that point in the conversation, which in most cases is my like showstopper, where I'm like, well, I don't live anywhere. I live on the road. I'm like, aren't I interesting? And like they didn't bat an eye. And Linda just looks back at me. She's like, oh yeah, we've lived on the road for 9 years. And I'm like, for 9 years. And so then
Wow.
it was just me interviewing them, me just personally, where I'm like, who are these wise old hobos who have materialized to like teach me their wandering ways? And it's a super cute story where I mean, they're couple goals. You just want to be like Tony and Linda Oyster. And they had been driving around the country for a decade. When he retired, he had some kind of fancy pants CFO job at some company in Florida. And his last day at work, he signs his closure paperwork. He walks out the door. She's waiting in the parking lot with the RV. He gets in, they drive off. They've never been back since. And so they just
Oh,
drive across the country, sometimes park, sometimes they'll stay for a couple of months in like Pahrump, Nevada or something. But I have a feeling they're the couple I remember and the one I talked to, but I would guess a lot of couples have similar stories. You see a lot of RV folks in the parks, but the younger version of that is van life. So it's
right.
they're sharing the same sites now, which are these like digital nomad 23-year-olds and then retirees, which is an interesting dichotomy. They even mentioned that they're making new younger friends that they
Oh,
didn't
I
expect
like
they'd have.
that.
Yeah.
And so they're kind of figuring it out because that's the thing, like all of these different people are occupying this space. And the unfortunate kind of, I think, American uh mentality sometimes is like, well, this is here for me and not like, this is here for all of us. And so I wonder if there is this kind of burgeoning conflict that exists when people from different walks of life start to exist in the same space and make it their own in a way that they want to do it. And I think obviously the more maybe salient one right now is the retirees and then the young Instagrammers. But of course, hopefully, as more and more people do feel welcome and there's more of a concerted effort by the parks departments to bring people in, you're going to see there's some growing pains there, maybe.
Yeah, well, and it's just reminding, and heck, I have to remind myself of this sometimes that like there's not a right or wrong way to experience a national park. There are certain rules that you need to abide by. You can't shoot the bison, and you can't, put
Leave
graffiti on
trash.
leave trash. You don't graffiti the rocks at Joshua Tree. But like I think I'm more into like the I want to do the long hike, and I want to do this, and I want quiet, and I want that. But like that's that's not the way it has to be for everybody. And so sometimes I might see a group of folks enjoying a park in a way that I wouldn't have thought to. And my instinct would be to sort of tisk tisk. And then it's like, well, no, it's for all of us. Just because you don't want to do my crazy mountain hike, and instead, would rather hang out with your friends and whatever. There's many different ways
Yeah.
to experience them. So, and that's the beauty of them, is that that they are for all of us. And you, a lot of the distinctions, and maybe I'm being naive about this, but like those divides that seem so stark when you're watching the news, the red state, blue state divides, like you don't really feel that in a park.
Mm.
There's like you you feel a sense of community with everyone who's there, whatever, however they might be enjoying the park, wherever they might come from. You already have one thing in common. It's like going to a concert of a band you like. Like once you're in that room, you're like, oh, huh. I guess we all like Ted Leo and the Pharmacist. Okay, cool. Like we got a thing in common. And so it's like here in this moment when there are so many other things you could be doing, you have chosen to spend your free time at a place like Canyonlands. Like you've already got a starting point for conversation with that person. And that's, I love that about the parks.
All right, guys, let's get back to the show. That's true. And I think that the way that people enjoy them might also in some ways kind of I don't want to say self-segregate. That's not a good way to put it. But, like if you're hiking a really sort of mindful trail and you come across somebody else, there's probably an unspoken way that you can commune, but also be respectful of the independence and the quiet. Yeah. Whereas if you're at a camping site that's a little more accessible and there are people like barbecuing and partying, you've probably chosen that camping site because you're in that kind of mind space as well.
Sure. I mean, there's just many, and I think the parks have done a good job of indicating different ways to experience the same place, even at different times of the day. Great Basin National Park in Nevada was one that, like, if you were to just go during the daytime, I don't think you would find it particularly impressive, but they have a saying there where half the park is after dark. And so a lot of their most interesting programs happen in the nighttime, when perhaps the retiree RVers are long asleep. But like if you manage to stay up and you get to see the Milky Way in a way that I have never seen it in my life. Certainly not in LA and not even in like a Joshua Tree. There's something, Great Basin is one of the darkest places in the country. There's some atmospheric reasons. I think partially it's just like there's some mountains that surround it that block out the what do they call it? The sky glow from Las Vegas, which is like the brightest place in the world. But somehow Great Basin stays extra dark. And so that it's, you could go for that reason. I mean, an underwater trail, like we talked about at Biscayne, that is like a very different way to experience that park, and a way that like, you do have to have scuba lessons and all that stuff to do, but you could also have a great time there hanging out at the picnic table and overlooking the water and the skyline of Miami in the distance. So.
Right. And that's the really cool thing that I think is so celebrated about the national parks in the US is that they're so different. Like, because the US is so big and because it has so many different like ecologies and different biomes and, just different geographies, you end up with national parks that have glaciers. You end up with national parks that are almost all water, or you end up being amidst the trees or amidst the rocks or amidst like Joshua Tree. It's like one of two places in the world, I think, that grow that kind of yucca plant. Like you have this view that is incredibly unique and specific to whichever part of the country you're in. And although it can be expensive, like we talked about, it's still for many Americans a lot less expensive than sort of international travel or travel that requires flights, because you can, with most of the national parks, just drive to get there.
Yeah, although, and this, I should have thought more about this when I began the journey, because when I started to look at them on a map and I'm like, okay, how am I going to get from here to there? Yes, the bulk of it was driving, but like there are some that the only way, I mean, obviously you have to fly to Hawaii, but then you can drive to those parks once you're in Hawaii. But there are certain parks, just to access the park itself, your only way in or out is on a seaplane or a boat or a little bush plane. So Isle Royal, Dry Tortugas, Gates of the Arctic National Park in Alaska is sort of misnamed because there are no gates. There's no ranger station. There's no tickets. There are no roads, no trails. It is just millions of acres of wilderness in the middle of nowhere.
Wow.
And so those became the parks that were very exciting for me, but also the ones I had to really plan a lot more for, because you can't just roll up whenever you feel like it. If you're trying to go to, I mean, for that matter, even Channel Islands near LA. I think there's a lot of people, myself included. I lived in LA for a decade and I never made it to Channel Islands National Park, even though I'd been to Joshua Tree a few times. Joshua Tree is arguably further, but it's just Channel Islands. You have to schedule that boat, or somehow find your way onto a plane. And so But I think once you go through that bit of extra effort, by the time you land in those parks, then it really, like, that is the most parkiest type person you're going to find, is someone who's made it to Kobuk Valley, Alaska. I mean, to the point where, like, honestly, if you make it to that one, you're probably doing the same thing I was. You are probably trying to see them all, because, like, that is
right.
there's no casual way to visit that. So.
Either that or it's your park. And I think that's the other thing that some people really identify with about the national parks is like depending on where you live in the country, there may be a park that is only a few hours away from your house, or a park that you think of as like the park you grew up visiting. So a lot of people have this mentality of like, oh, but my park is Joshua Tree. Like that's the park, or Yosemite. Those are the parks I go to because I live in LA. Did you have that experience like when you were traveling all these national parks, but you've lived in LA for a decade, before that in West Virginia? Was there like a homecoming type of feeling when you would go to parks that were, I don't know, more familiar to you?
For me, that was at Bryce Canyon and Zion National Park, both in Utah. When I was a kid, I got on a plane for the first time in my life when I was 14 years old, and we took a family trip from West Virginia out west. And it blew my mind. Like, I'd never seen any landscape that looked remotely like that before. West Virginia is beautiful and lush and mountainous, but Bryce Canyon looks like Mars. Like it just like it just sort of opened my eyes to like, oh wow, there's a big country out there. Because I think the only thing that looked kind of different than where I grew up was like Myrtle Beach. We'd go there sometimes, but here all of a sudden I was like, wow, like if this is here, then what does Alaska look like? What's Montana look like? And so the travel bug kind of ignited for me then. But I've since been back to those parks a few different times. Before the year of going to them all. But then I also went back during that year. I've been back even since. And there's something that, honestly, it feels more like a homecoming going back to those parks than it does my actual home. The home I grew up in, I moved out of when I was 17. We moved across town. And when I was, at some points when I've been back in West Virginia, I've driven by that first house we lived in, and it looks totally different now. Like they've changed the siding, they mowed down some trees in the yard that was beside of ours. I mean, there's new owners and they should do whatever they want with it. But like, it's sort of unsettling for me because I see that I'm like, okay, that is sort of my house, but like too much has changed for it to still feel like home. Whereas when I drive through those gates of Bryce Canyon, like it looks exactly the same, to my eyes at least, as it did when I was 14. So the parks, if we treat them correctly, are the homes that don't change.
Right.
And so that, especially now as I continue to bounce around and don't really have a permanent address, those feel more like home to me than really anywhere else right now.
That's an interesting thing that I guess I never really thought about, but obviously that's probably a big source of kind of comfort, is the familiarity and most of the time when we think of national parks, we think of a unique geography or a unique climate to these parks, right? Like whether it's the desert or whether it's big trees or big rocks or whatever. And there is something very kind of comforting about the fact that like the same tree that you saw in Sequoia, might still obviously probably is still there.
Yeah.
Like you can go visit the same damn tree
Exactly.
or the same big rock in Joshua Tree that's like not going anywhere anytime soon.
I mean, it might have grown a little taller, but I have too since then,
Right.
But yeah, it is the same tree. That said, to the extent that some of them are different, that's maybe when it's more striking. So Glacier National Park, I think, is a good example of that in Montana. Within our lifetimes, I mean, really within the next decade, Glacier National Park will have no more glaciers. And which is just not, and like really that's irreversible. That is for sure going to happen. There's only like 25 some left. While I was there, I went out with this guy from the USGS who was taking photographs of where the ice used to be. So he had these really cool images from sometimes 50, sometimes 100 years ago, of these massive just walls of, Game of Thrones looking ice walls. And they're all gone. But he would find where that photographer had taken that picture. He would take the same picture just to sort of show what had been lost. For that matter, Joshua Tree may not have Joshua trees one day. There's a very specific sort of balance of factors that allow them to exist where they are. And if those factors change, they may not. So it's probably naive to say that like these places that don't change, like they do clearly. But at a slower rate than I think the rest of our world is changing. Like there's we're fortunately not paving them and putting Costco's in them. So you can do, and maybe in that way you can observe the pace of the natural world a little bit more clearly because there's nothing else that we're really doing to them. Then you can really dial in, and they become these laboratories in a lot of ways where a lot of the research that's being done, climate change and how different species react to that, like that's happening in parks because they're sort of protected from other external factors.
Right. They're managed and in many ways like buffered because like you said, we're not paid them and we're not like living inside of houses when we're kind of on that land. I mean, did your experience as you were traveling through, because of course, I think it's very easy for people to say flippantly, like even before reading the book, when they think about, oh yeah, you visit all these parks, you're going to have some like spiritual experience or some profound meditative experience. And of course, that's going to happen. Did you find that those kinds of experiences were bittersweet? Like, was the balance of the awe and the wonder and the beauty of nature tempered at all by the realization that like it's really fleeting and that you can see evidence of that in some of these more extreme cases?
Yeah, there was a bit of that. I mean, certainly at that park, I felt lucky to be seeing this thing that, like, should I ever have kids one day, I'll have to tell them about because those glaciers won't be there anymore. The glacier I saw that day, but it was mostly gratitude just for being lucky enough to be able to have that kind of adventure, and then also for what had been done before I arrived on the scene to make sure that that was there for me to see. Um, that's why the book's called "Leave Only Footprints." There's another version of that saying, which is basically like, don't throw your trash on the ground. But the more common version is "Leave no trace," and that's what you see a little bit more. But "Leave Only Footprints" to me seems like that fit more with my experience because it's not like you're not leaving a trace. Like everywhere I went, I saw traces of people who had been there before me and the decisions that they've made and how those are playing out in my lifetime. And it made me think more about the decisions that that will be made in my lifetime and how those will affect people in the future. And that's more of a footprint. It is a light touch that hopefully shows the way forward and maybe a way for us to find our way back. But we're clearly leaving a trace. And so it's mostly about what is that trace? What do we want that legacy to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the more that I have been sort of learning about ecology and land management, as I start to care more about those things as I get older, and broaden sort of my scientific understanding into those places, the more I'm sort of awakened with a realization that wildness is kind of not a thing in most
Yeah.
places anymore. And that doesn't mean that doesn't mean that nothing is wild. There are wild animals, there are wild places, but everything on the planet is managed. Like as I've visited Africa multiple times now, I've begun to realize that what we think of as the places where we see, big herd of wildebeest or these beautiful giraffes or, a family of lions who are eating, like these are in managed areas, often fenced areas. They might be thousands of hectares large, but people are involved in maintaining wilderness. It's not just that there's an out there and an in here anymore, that our footprints are everywhere.
Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you, it still feels pretty damn wild when you run into a grizzly bear at Katmai National Park that I wasn't expecting.
Right.
Or I guess technically it's a brown bear, but yeah. You've got enough science listeners who will be like, well, actually, brown bears feed on coastal resources and grizzly bears eat inland food.
Like Conor Knighton.
Yes. So, yes, the brown bear at Katmai, like it feels wild. There is no person who will intervene to keep that from biting you if you piss it off.
And these
yes.
are the most wild places in our country, are the preserved places because nobody can lay claim to them in a sort of resource extraction way. But of course, we know their history, and that's something that I definitely think is good to read up on, is in many ways about kicking out indigenous people, about
For sure.
being somewhat, not somewhat, completely disrespectful of the people who were there first, to say, let's make this actually virgin land or wild land when it was managed for thousands and thousands of years previously.
Exactly. And I kind of made a blanket disclaimer early in the book and still felt like that wasn't enough. So I'd continue to do it. But if I'm talking about who discovered Wind Cave in, South Dakota, all right, he's the first guy who wrote down that he discovered it. But there is no chance that he is people who lived, in that, on that landscape for thousands of years knew there was a cave there. They didn't need some random white dude to tell them that.
Exactly.
So yeah, that many times over, and you see that in place names, most of which are still the names bestowed by much later arrivals on the scene. But Denali is a good example. So Denali for years was Mount McKinley. Finally switched back to Denali, as I think people realized that first of all, naming it after a 5'7" Ohioan who had never been to Alaska was a weird thing to do. McKinley had not been there. But also, Denali was its name. It means the high one. Why change that? And so that's the parks are getting better both in naming and also just in the stories they tell of having that kind of acknowledgement. Not great. I mean, definitely could be much better. But it's kind of amazing to me for how many years that wasn't a part of the story. I'm sure for shame, for a lot of reasons. But now more and more at the visitor center, in a campfire presentation. I mean, at the parks in Washington State, they'll begin a lot of presentations with an acknowledgement. Well, they'll say, hey, listen, before we kick things off, before I tell you about the salamander, I want to let you know that we're standing on Nisqually land and blah, blah, blah. And so it goes a long way to just sort of making sure that story stays in people's mind.
And I think a lot of that is secondary to pressure from individuals who are, understanding, who are more aware of the fact that yes, when we say something and this happens a lot in my line of work and when I'm doing SciComm, when somebody says, oh, this, thing that was just discovered, this new species. And it's no, I think there's been a concerted effort to say it was first named to science, or you see space missions, right? These aren't manned missions, they're crewed missions. There are women who are involved.
Yeah.
And these more mindful ways to talk about things. And of course, they've been naming the land for the people who first and often still do inhabit it in New Zealand for a very long time, in Canada. And I think that Americans are getting hip to the fact that the indigenous people who basically were subject to genocide by our own government and our own people have a long and rich and beautiful history that we should be honoring. It's a lot of it is too little too late, but it's something, like you said, it's a start, and hopefully it continues, especially I think in the context of the national parks, because if there's something that equally, again, that paradox equally embodies white colonialism, but also historical and in many ways paleontological land, it would be these national parks.
Well, it's an easier place to tell that story because it still looks the same. I mean, it's a story of Manhattan also, but
right.
There's skyscrapers now, so the parks would still be the last place that many generations of ancestors ago would still recognize. And so, that is maybe a way to not just tell the story of the park, but that larger story that is true for really most of the country. If you could kind of give that lesson a little bit more directly and impactfully inside of a park.
So speaking of lessons learned, you organized your book according to these themes, not so much according to first I went here, then I went there, and these 10 places were geographically similar. But you mentioned that there were these themes that emerged where you could in some ways find common threads between parks that might be in disparate places. I mean, how did you come to coalesce all of these different experiences together to be able to write this book, to be able to come up with these themes? Were there theses, was there a central thesis? Are there multiple theses that ultimately, as you were reflecting on your experience, you were able to pull out? What are those core kind of takeaways for you?
Yeah, I mean, the themes, and if you look down the chapter list, you'll see some of them are not the most creative. Some of them are very literal. There are 3 national parks that have caves in them. I'm like, how about we call that chapter caves? So
Right. Yeah.
we got that.
They're a taxonomist if there ever were one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then more of like, but home or forgiveness, those are love, God. Um, those were the more amorphous and sort of more like philosophical themes. And so, yeah, I mean, it changed my relationship with a lot of things. I mean, from technology and realizing the importance of disconnecting, which I think we all know in theory, but it sort of takes like you can put your phone in do not disturb mode, but like when you're left without a choice, when you're in one of the last places left in the country with no cell phone service for 6 days, then you really remember the value of that. And then maybe you're more likely to turn it off for 60 minutes when you get back home. To spirituality, and like, having the kinds of experiences that I might have once had in the church growing up, having those, and many people have gone down this road before, but like having those out in nature was a very, important part of that experience for me. And yeah, I mean, it had come after a setback in my personal life. I was engaged, and then all of a sudden I wasn't anymore, and I was sort of set adrift. And I sort of refused to look at this year as a silver lining. For the first many parks, I still wanted my old life back. I thought that this future I'd planned for was the future I wanted. And then by the time the year ended, I could not have imagined it going any other way. I mean, it was by far the most scenic, interesting, important year of my life. And I mean, everything from light pollution and the value of a dark sky to the value of and calming influence of like being near water, really just changed the way that I think about the world. And it's partially why I haven't re-entered society. I mean, it makes me sound like the Unabomber, but like I haven't had a permanent address since 2016. I have continued to live on the road, not quite like van lifing it. Like I'll rent an Airbnb here or a cabin there. But I've continued to stay, full time out there, just because I didn't quite want to finish with that experience yet. And it will be a part of, my life for the rest of my life. But I knew that, once I start paying a utility bill again, I'm kind of, back in some city, back more into a grind of what my life used to be like. And so I wanted to linger as long as possible as I could in these places. And in places like it over the past few years, I haven't been doing national parks as much as I have like some stories across the world for CBS. But like, if you're sending me to Bornholm Island in Denmark, like I'm going to stick around for a few extra days on my own dime and continue to use that money I used to spend on rent to live out on the road.
And so what's your plan then? I mean, moving forward, this was such a big part of your life for, a full year plus, and now you're kind of sort of re-entering, reacclimating, but at the same time trying to figure out how to make this lifestyle continue to work. I mean, have you thought about what's next for you?
I haven't. It's weird that it's taken a pandemic to get me to stay in one place because,
yeah, because you're not allowed to leave.
I'm not allowed to go. Yeah, although stay at home is a challenging mandate to follow when you don't have a home. So I'm speaking to you from a cottage I'm renting, and it's fine for now. But I've had the upsides of that life many, many times over, and I think they're just pretty easy to imagine what those are. It's never boring. I'm in a lot of just really fascinating, beautiful places, but there's something to be said for having leftovers in the fridge and your own art on the walls and just a night of Netflix at home and
being able to get a dog.
Yeah, right. The dog.
To me, that's such a big part is like having my dog here with me. Like a lot of it I could leave, but he'd be a really tough thing to give up, I think.
Sure. A fourth date. I mean, there's lots of things.
Right. Oh yeah, that too.
This would benefit my life. I appreciate that you went straight to dog. and honestly,
yeah, whatever.
Honestly, that's
screw your dates.
Yeah. Well, I could get a dog tomorrow. I think that dates are probably, at least in my life, have been a little harder to come by. But I think, yeah, there's some benefits to staying in one place. I'm ready to do that again. I guess what I've wondered is, does that place need to be LA? I like LA a lot. I have I have more friends here than anywhere else. But I've never judged it more on its merits than I am right now. The last time I chose to move to LA, I was 21. I thought this is where I had to be to work in television. And for some jobs, it is. It just so happens that for the job I have right now, I could be based really anywhere that there's an airport that can get me places. And so, and there's lots of cheaper places than here. And so I've started to weigh the pros and the cons. In a way, it's too much choice. I kind of envy folks who it's like, all right, you work for United Airlines and we can base you in Houston, Chicago, or San Francisco, pick one, but when, I will get no sympathy for this, but like the fact that I could kind of be based out of a lot of places, it's sort of too much to choose. And so by default, I very well may end up back here. Well, I should phrase that differently. I very well may end up back here. I hope that that's not by default. I hope I've weighed my options and said, all right, I gave Denver a shot. I've looked at Seattle. Nashville seems great, but I just really like Pasadena. And then maybe I come back here anyway. But this would have been
Pasadena
the month.
is nice.
I love Pasadena. I feel like I'm in the Pasadena Tourism Bureau because I lived there until I moved for this crazy weird life. That's where I had been living. No one, I feel like I tried to say, don't say you like Pasadena. I feel like I tried to sell you on Pasadena. And like even you were, well, actually you may be the rare exception because you have Caltech buddies. So maybe you were into Pasadena, but I feel like most people I would say Pasadena stuff too would be like, oh, it's so far, like meh. And I'm like, it is 20 minutes.
Oh no, I live in Eagle Rock.
Yeah, I'm super close. You weren't then, I don't think. Were you? I can't remember.
No, I was in Los Feliz then, or maybe Hollywood.
Exactly.
But I've always been an East Side girl.
Yeah. See, I like it a lot, but it feels far to some folks. So who knows? I need to have a better answer. And really, like with the book now out, it does, to use a stupid book pun, like closes the chapter on that part of my life where like the year itself was a journey. There was the process of writing it. There was the process of putting this thing out. And now it really does feel like a thing that I can kind of have in the rear view mirror and say, all right, what's the next thing? What's life look like going forward? And it's exciting. I mean, in a lot of ways, I am in the same place I was around this time 4 years and a few months ago, where there's a lot of uncertainty. And it feels like an adventure is about to happen. And I'm sort of ready for whatever that is. So I don't have a good answer for you, but I can tell something's about to happen.
Well, it's a journey, like everything else. It's a journey, and it's going to keep on keeping on.
Yeah, if I don't bankrupt myself with DoorDash orders in between. 4 years off from living at a place has not made me a better cook. So especially now when there's like no restaurant to go to, I'm like, okay, bring me food. So I've tried to make some things, but it ain't going great. So
I don't want to share this little hack nationally because I don't want it to become overrun, but hopefully I have a small enough percentage of listeners from our neck of the woods. But the other day I was in Pasadena delivering little like self-care kits that I was making for some of my friends who still live there. I was putting them on their doorstep like a little mental health fairy. And I was hungry. So I was like, ooh, I want a hot dog. So I went to Doghouse and picked up a hot dog. And then I was like, where can I eat this? Because you can't go in restaurants anymore except to just pick up food. So I walked across Caltech campus, which is open right now, so long as you are observing social distancing and wearing a mask and being respectful of all of these rules. Like there are signs on campus that say, Caltech visitors, in light of COVID-19, please be respectful and follow these rules. So I was able to sit on park benches in front of beautiful fountains.
It's great. I've been over there in this recent time as well. I have the same take on it, where it's and it's great. You see, people with strollers and kids and stuff, but it's a big enough place that I didn't feel like anybody was encroaching. You see those pictures of like Huntington Beach and you're like, oh gosh, what are you guys doing? Yeah. But like, Caltech seemed fine. But even really just like the ritzy streets of Pasadena, and these were not the streets I lived on, but like if you continue past Caltech, like toward the Huntington Library and like San Marino and stuff, there's just massively wide streets where, you have plenty of room to roam. So
yes, I remember thinking
for a place I've been trying to find, like a lot of my priorities aren't priorities right now, which is like near cool restaurants or near friends. Like it doesn't quite matter now. I just want like a place with a wide street I can walk down and like a door that only I touch.
A door behind a fence. Oh, and all the fruit trees. I remember thinking that as I was driving down these, like you said, ritzy streets with all these like really tree lined, like beautiful shaded areas, but these basically like manors in Pasadena. And I remember thinking, I don't know. I'm like, they can't be professors. Professors don't make that much money.
No, and I don't think they're entertainment folks either. It just makes you realize how many random rich people there are in the world.
Oh my God,
in LA. We're like,
so many in LA.
In Pasadena, I don't think. I think that's mostly, West Side Palisades, Hollywood Hills, all that stuff. But so
I think it's old money in Pass, but it is definitely. I'm looking around, walking around, driving around, whatever, and I remember thinking to myself, like, do you think they would mind if I just take a few oranges off their tree?
I mean, what do they do? What do they care? Whatever. Actually, maybe they've entirely made their fortune off of like Orange Tree prosecutions or whatever. Like they sue you for this. It's all a trap. You're screwed.
Damn it.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Well, Conor, gosh, this has been such a great chat. There's so much more that we could obviously get to because your book is jam-packed, but I also want people to buy your book. So I'm not going to ask you to tell me every story from it.
I'll just give you the audiobook right now. You have 10 hours.
Yeah, exactly. And go. But before I close with you, you know, I always close my podcast episode by asking the people I'm chatting with the same two questions. And they're sort of like big picture, maybe a little more existential questions. So you want to play?
Let's play. Wait, I should have prepared because I know. I know what these are. I've listened and I've heard them, but I can't remember what they are right now. All right,
yes.
go for it.
They're evil because they're right at the end.
I feel like anybody else, a more responsible listener, would have a prepared answer for this. And I know what's coming. Oh, crap. All right, go for it. Go for it.
But then we'd all know. Okay.
Then we'd all know.
When you look to the future in whatever context is relevant to you, so it could be informed by your journey to all these national parks, by your work, by where you are in your life, or by like bigger kind of geopolitical or sociopolitical things. Number one, what is the thing that's really keeping you up the most at night that you're concerned about, maybe even, I don't know, pessimistic or cynical about? And on the flip side of that, so that, you know, we're not totally depressed when we say goodbye, what are you genuinely and authentically hopeful for, you know, really looking forward to and optimistic about?
Right. It's a good question. It is a good question. And you know what? It's a very short-term answer I might have to the first part of things based on when we're recording this, which is that like I think sometimes you may mean keeping you up at night, like in a figurative sense, but literally, like, what am I doing until like 3 a.m. is reading pandemic news stories, you know, like it is a scary time. And it's just like, it's gone on for long enough that like, I think about it, and I'm so lucky, gosh, it's impacted me so little compared to how much it's impacting other folks. But I feel like every night I think of another way that it's impacting other folks where I'm like, oh yeah, like divorced parents, what are they doing right now? You know, like I don't know why that occurred to me yesterday, but I'm like, that must be really hard to like share a kid right now. But then all of the like the sickness and the you know, obviously the people who are suffering from it aside, but economically suffering from it. I mean, that's like it's on everyone's minds right now. So it's hard for me to think of something beyond that of just like, oh gosh, how do we come back from this? Is this, or you know, what's life like even 5 years from now? But I think, I mean, to tie it in a little bit to where we were at in the book, like I do work. I mean, climate change, like not that you need to visit all the parks or even a park to think about that, but that I think about a lot. What keeps me hopeful is, take something like the Endangered Species Act. That is our species saying, beyond our own self-interest, we are going to preserve these creatures, like just because it's the right thing to do. Like that is not a thing that other species do, you know, like generally if it's one animal keeping another alive, they've got a reason for it. And there's some sort of a symbiotic relationship. And we like that is unique to humans. And the parks are like that. There's a Teddy Roosevelt quote that I like, and I'm going to butcher it a little bit, but it's to sit back and read the paper and scoff at the misdeeds of evil men, you know, basically does no good. It's what evil men count upon the good men doing. So like there are, even with the parks, bad things happening, you know, drilling and certain national monuments being condensed in size, which hardly ever happens. Normally a president expands them. But like for every time something like that happens, like there are enough folks mobilized to fight that good fight. And that overall is a story of progress that is exciting to me. Like that, you know, America's best idea was not a one-off idea. It is an evolving idea, and it's exciting to see that grow and change and see it improve. So that keeps me hopeful. I feel like you know, we're doing more good than we are harm, and there's enough folks who are far, you know, like who I'm inspired by, who are working to address those things. So yeah, I think that's a bad answer to a great question, but
no,
I should have thought about it more. It's okay. It's average. It's average. Let's talk about Pasadena orange trees again. It's okay. So that's where I'm at right now. But yeah, hopefully, the fact that we're not doing this in person, what the heck?
I know you're right down the street. Damn it!
I know, but so that it's hard not to think about anything but that right now, since it impacts so much of things, professional stuff, family stuff.
Yeah.
I was talking to my parents yesterday. When do I get to see them again? I don't know. The plan was that I would have been there this month, and we were going to take a trip in August. I don't know if that's happening. So it affects every aspect of life, and that's it's true for everybody right now. So.
It is. It's true. And it's, I think because we're in the middle of it, it's so hard. We don't have hindsight yet. So it's so hard to know what the new normal is going to be. But, kind of piggybacking what you just said in your answer, we are innovative and we will persist and we will figure this out kind of together as a species. And although there's always going to be those among us who aren't interested in the science and aren't interested in the evidence and are more short-sighted in our decision-making processes. The good news is that on the whole, we are sort of, bending towards justice and progress. It might sometimes be, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, but I don't think it's 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. And because of that, I think that there is a lot to be hopeful for, even in the midst of, sometimes looking through the pain that it seems a bit intolerable, like most people are experiencing right now. Yeah. But I'm so glad that we had a chance to talk about this. I'm so glad that your new book, honestly, is kicking ass and taking names, because I know it's a very hard time for a book to be coming out.
It's a weird time. And
it's
what
really
books are doing weirdly
time.
well are like kids' workbooks. So there was a day where it was the number 6 book on all of Amazon, which was very exciting, but I can't get too cocky about it because the number 5 book was my big preschool workbook, ABC 1, 2, 3. So,
yeah.
Good for, whoever wrote that, that's not a book that would crack the top 10,000 normally all of a sudden. There's science experiments for 5th graders. So a lot of these random, I get it. People are stuck at home trying to figure out what to do. So yeah, it's a weird time for books in general, but I'm thrilled and honored, even for good old Bruce, who bought the wrong version on Kindle. I'm glad that anybody is looking for it, and hopefully, there's a time. And indie bookstores, by the way, they all have websites. I'm trying to plug them where it's Amazon is actually probably the worst place to buy this book right now. They're prioritizing home goods and stuff, and which they should, but they're shipping cereal faster than they're shipping books. But if you go to your independent bookstore's website, they will ship it tomorrow. So.
Absolutely. And you'll be contributing to help keep them alive.
Exactly. They need your support. Amazon will be fine. We'll be fine.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And you don't need that many more Amazon packages on your porch.
No, right? Hey, I'm as guilty as everybody else of using them all the time. And even for books for that matter. But right now there's a way to do good and also get things faster, which would be support the independent bookstore.
Truth. I think if you bought this along with some other books on an independent bookstore's website, they would all come in the same package, maybe. You would get 7 boxes.
Instead of just Amazon ships the spine and the jacket separately.
It's you have to assemble it.
Here's that. Yeah, but we thought you might want some more packing peanuts. Here you go.
Oh, Conor, it is always a pleasure. I can't wait until we can have a cup of coffee together in person, maybe with a physical newspaper in front
right.
of
That, or I didn't know you were a doghouse fan. Let's get some dogs.
Oh, hell yeah. Let's do that. I'll bring my dog, but we won't eat him. We'll eat actual hot dogs.
That is too many dogs.
Too many dogs in one place.
That is only food dogs. No, you can bring your dog too.
Maybe by then you'll have a dog too, and our dogs can meet.
Maybe I'll have a dog. That's a good. I would be so bad at being a dog. We can talk about that some other time.
Part 2.
But yeah, I don't know. I like them. I don't know if I need to own them. So we'll see. But yeah, great talking to you. I look forward to seeing you soon. And thank you. This has been such a nice conversation. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. And I forgot to say, everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.